So for anyone who's just joined, thank you very much for joining us this morning for our webinar. It's on myth-busting NIS2 on the road to compliance. My name is Paul Conaty, a Client Solutions Director at CWSI, and with me today I have James Leo, Data Security and Compliance Technical Specialist at Microsoft. James, do you want to take a second there to introduce yourself to the audience?
Good morning, Paul. Thanks for having me here today. So I'm a data security and compliance technical specialist with Microsoft Ireland, working with our compliance solutions naturally across the security stack, the Microsoft Security Suite. So it's great to be here today, Paul, to talk about all things NIS2 related.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, James. And my name is Paul Conaty. As I mentioned, I'm Client Solutions Director at CWSI. So my role is to work with our customers around their GRC, security and compliance requirements, programs, particularly in the areas of cloud security and mobile and endpoint. So there's a couple of things we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start with just a very short introduction to who CWSI are, in case we have anybody on the call who doesn't know who we are. And then we're going to get straight into the really interesting stuff. We're going to talk a little bit around the kind of myths that are floating around or things that we're hearing people say around NIS2 that may or may not be accurate. And then we're going to have a look at, getting into a bit more detail around how NIS2 differs from NIS1, how will NIS2 affect different types of organizations, in particular multinational organizations. James is going to give a bit more detail around how Microsoft themselves are addressing NIS2. And then we're going to wrap up hopefully with some useful kind of takeaways and actions that you could take away from the call to help you with getting ready for NIS2. So first of all, a quick introduction to who are CWSI. So, our purpose in our organization is very simple. It's to enable the world to work securely from anywhere. So that basically means any device, any location, any time, accessing whatever applications are relevant to your need. I think that's what the world is looking for now, and that's been our purpose since the company was founded. Our areas of expertise, so we grew out of a mobile security and management business back in 2010. That's where the company was founded, and that meant that from the very early on we were looking at cloud-based management, cloud-based security. So we have been a cloud security company from very early on, and that's the kind of key area of our expertise. Obviously, we are leaders in modern endpoint security, so that mobile background has now become an endpoint background. Endpoint management has now become MDM or UEM in the same way that we manage mobile, because of that requirement to be able to have workers working from all sorts of different locations, networks on and off LAN. So that's driven the modern endpoint requirement. And also through acquisition and growth, we have gained an ability in secure application development. We were always quite strong at advising organizations on how to secure applications from third parties, but we now also have an ability to deliver and create applications ourselves through our team in the Netherlands, particularly specializing in high security requirements and use cases such as policing, healthcare, military kind of applications. So that's kind of specialist areas that we've worked in. And then finally, the area that's probably relevant to what we're talking about today is we have our team of experts advising business around cyber strategy, focusing on areas like governance, risk and compliance and advisory. So, cloud security, the development in modern endpoint security, the kind of application-driven world, all of these, require a change potentially in how organizations adopt or update their cyber strategy. And that's something that we're well placed to help organizations with. We've offices in 5 countries in Northwestern Europe. Obviously, Ireland is where CWSI started out, but through acquisition, we've grown into the UK, Benelux, and Netherlands regions. And in most cases, the organizations that we've acquired are very similar to ourselves, with a long history in endpoint and cloud security, with some various specializations in different areas, as mentioned, like application security, and also we have a lot around end-to-end full device lifecycle management in our Belgian piece, with some very unique capabilities around our management platforms. We also have a wide customer base of multinationals. So we currently support major multinational organizations across North America, Asia, and Northern Africa. So it's not just a European footprint. We have the ability to support organizations globally. So I'd like to start with maybe setting the scene about why are we talking about NIS2? Why is NIS2, or regulation itself, why are we seeing so much more regulation coming into basically every regulated environment? It's not just the EU. We're seeing new regulation coming across the world: Australia, Asia, the US, China. There's different types of regulation coming in around cybersecurity, data security, and privacy. And some of the reasons for that are, statistically, we're seeing, 3/4 of organizations recently surveyed experiencing at least one data security incident. So this is the Microsoft Data Security Index. This is a global stat, but this is replicated, I think, locally. There was a Sunday Business Post survey done recently in Ireland of Irish businesses, and it was 71% of businesses that reported a data breach within the last calendar year, which is very, very close to this 74% stat. So 3/4 of organizations experiencing at least one data security incident. It's become almost a normal thing that's going to happen. Obviously, they can vary in their impact, but it is up significantly from 5 or 10 years ago. Over 61% of businesses impacted by supply chain attacks in the past year. This is from a different Microsoft report, the Digital Defense Report. But supply chain is a major weak point in organizations, and is a very common method of trying to get into organizations that might have very strong or mature security boundaries for their own infrastructure, but the supply chain could potentially be a weak point because they have integrations, or they have access or accounts in your organization. And we've seen things like SolarWinds. We've seen things like leveraging suppliers like air conditioning suppliers or other types of suppliers in various different attacks, high-profile attacks over the last couple of years, and proving as a very effective methods to get into organizations. We're seeing a huge amount of attacks against identity, because obviously if identity is compromised, well then, that is a major entry point for attackers to get into your organization. If they can compromise a user, then they can start moving laterally. They can look to elevate permissions. They can start, discovering the landscape of your environment, and get ready for some kind of ransomware or data exfiltration or attack. But once they're they're looking to compromise an identity to get in. So we're seeing a huge amount of attacks. So 4,000 identity attacks blocked per second, coming from Microsoft telemetry globally in 2023. And Microsoft are quite well placed to pick up this amount of data because of their kind of ubiquity in organizations, public and private sector globally. And then finally, over 16% of breaches where phishing was the initial attack vector. So phishing is still one of the major methods used to get into an organization, either to steal identity information or to potentially load malware, or use that as a weak point to pivot into an organization. And that's coming from IBM's cost of a data breach report. And again, there's various different stats around the level of phishing in different regions and the effectiveness. I think when it comes to data breaches specifically, it's a huge percentage of data breaches. We're down to phishing attacks. I think it's over 50% of where phishing was the cause. So it's a major problem. So all of these are painting a picture that there's a huge volume of attacks. They are coming at us from various different areas, but the kind of key ones are supply chain, your attacks against identity, and attacks against users via phishing. And a lot of us are getting impacted. 3 in 4 organizations saying that they have experienced a data security incident. There may be more going unreported. So all of this is putting a lot of concern in regulatory bodies, in national bodies across the world, in particular in the EU, and in particular focusing in on areas like national infrastructure, critical infrastructure, because the impact now with our highly connected, highly digitalized way of living is that, you know, these kind of attacks have a massive potential real world impact. So it's there's a requirement to do something about it. Hopefully there's a poll appearing on your screen there now. Just want to take a quick couple of questions if you want to just answer that quickly. And then we'll move on to the next slide. It's really for us to get an idea of where some of you are. Okay, I'll give you a couple more seconds just to answer that poll, and then we'll move on. Okay. We'll come back to those results at the end. Hopefully what you see in today's session might change your perspective on some of the things you've answered. We're going to start around some common myths that we hear around NIS2. So this is things that myself and people like James and others commonly hear organizations say to us when we're in conversations with them, or you see it in discussions online or in other forums or at events. And there's a couple of key ones here, really. The first is that NIS2 only applies to large organizations. And the reality is that this is not true. And we're going to go through this in quite a bit more detail later on. But NIS2 is really focused on the impact that a cyber attack on an organization could have on critical infrastructure or on society in general. So that doesn't necessarily apply only to large organizations. That could also apply to smaller organizations that provide critical services and that whole supply chain piece that we mentioned already in the statistics. So that's definitely not true. The second is that NIS2 will be very expensive and difficult to implement. This is more of a maybe. This will really depend on your current maturity. So, you know, if you are a very mature organization in terms of your cybersecurity and you've put in a lot of best practice, good cybersecurity hygiene, NIS2 is likely not to be a significant overhead for you. It's really just a little bit around reporting a few other areas. If you are not in a mature situation and you haven't invested in cybersecurity, well then having to comply with NIS2 is going to be a much bigger piece of work. NIS2, this is probably one of the most common ones. James, I think this is probably one that we hear a lot, is the NIS2 could be ignored until national legislation is implemented. I don't know if you want to comment on how often you hear this one.
Well, yeah, October is our big date in the calendar this year for NIS2. The basics requirements, the baseline benchmarks, NIS2 has been in effect since January of last year, Paul. So while for some organizations they might wonder whether yet they will fall under scope or not, for those that know, the minimum that needs to be done to have a good compliance posture, that's already known to us, and action that time period between January and October last year and this year, that was that implementation period, that time to get up to speed. You talked about the maturity. What have we implemented? What can we implement now based on what we know of the requirements?
Yeah, I think that's important, and it's something we're going to talk about later on. Is, you know, you really, you know, should already be evaluating, one, if you're going to fall under NIS2, or, you know, two, if you're maybe not directly under NIS2, but your major customer base is, because they are probably going to be looking for you to answer a lot of tough questions around cybersecurity. And as James pointed out there correctly, the October deadline is just to get the national legislation implemented. the NIS2 is already in place and in force, with the minimum standards already kind of published. So it's definitely not something that you can be ignoring. And then I think the last one, is one I hear occasionally, that I'm already ISO certified, or maybe I use the NIST frameworks or something else, so I'm already covered for NIS2. This is a bit like the second point, sort of. If you have a good, mature piece in place, then that's definitely going to help you be ready for NIS2, but it doesn't mean you have to do nothing. You're still going to have to look at some degree of mapping and gap analysis to close those gaps. And I'd also be wary, particularly in the area of ISO, a lot of organizations will be ISO certified, but their scope could be quite narrow. NIS2 is quite a broad scope. So, you really want to be making sure that if you're ISO certified, that kind of covers all of your business applications and not just a specific narrow scope, which can be quite common, because that could leave you with a gap when it comes to the NIS2 requirements. Just like to point out at this stage as well, if there's any questions on anything we're talking about today, I'd encourage you to put them into the chat, and we'll either address them as we go or at the end. So if you just want to drop those questions into the chat as we go, that'd be great. Thank you very much.
I guess with that last myth there, Paul, with the ISO 27001 certification, you mentioned mapping, so it's worth pointing out that on the NISA website, there are mappings for the NIST controls to popular frameworks and guidelines. Interestingly enough, the mapping, if I remember rightly, rather than ISO 27001, it's to ISO 27002. So. Yep. ISO 27001 certifies our ISMS, whereas the accompanying guidelines in the 27000 series focus on the implementation, and that's where NISA are focusing as well.
Yep, and that's a really good resource. Thanks for mentioning that, James, for people, is to have a look at those, where you can have a look at those mapping frameworks on the NISA site. Okay, so how does NIS2 differ from NIS1? Because this, there was a NIS1 previously, some of you may already be aligned or you fall under NIS1, but there is quite a few substantial differences between NIS2 and NIS1, which is what we'd like to address in this section. So I think some of the key areas is that it expands the scope of the previous NIS1 directive. So NIS2 is an expansion. So NIS1 was much more focused really on the very critical infrastructure elements, things like power and water, those kind of areas, and was probably really focused on things like OT and your key infrastructure elements, and did not really have as wide a scope for the kind of more modern integrated environment that most organizations work in. James, I don't know if there's anything else you want to kind of comment on there in terms of that expansion of scope.
I guess not just that more entities, but more sectors as well, like manufacturing, for example, being brought in. I think it's mentioned below that responsibility as well on this slide, where that responsibility lies is far more clearly defined, with that stricter enforcement too, of course.
Yeah, and I think the responsibility is a key one now. There's much more focus on board level responsibility as well in terms of implementing and being directly potentially responsible. A new framework around things like vulnerability disclosure, which I think is a great idea, because we all learn from each other, and having a better model for being able to share that information across entities in the EU is a kind of a rising tide raises all boats model, which I think is fantastic. It's the minimum measures are very kind of defined in terms of having to construct proper risk assessments around your business, your critical business processes, and the underlying ICT infrastructure around those, and then the cybersecurity controls around those in turn. Specifically calling out things like multi-factor, The supply chain security we've mentioned, I think, is a very key component because of the amount of attacks that come through that pathway. And then also, incident response plans. And I think a key around those is expanding them out, making sure that full business input is covered in the incident and response plan. So these are all really good measures that are kind of bringing up the minimum standard cybersecurity hygiene within organizations and their operational resilience. And then also the enforcement level, there's going to be defined, national bodies which will have a responsibility for oversight, auditing and certification of organizations in each of the member states, which is going to give a bit more, I think, focus on the enforcement and compliance there. So we mentioned the expansion in scope, and James mentioned, the additional sectors. So, NIS2 has this kind of core model of what is called essential or important organizations. And as you can probably see there, the essential list, which probably would have been the focus in NIS1, has expanded quite significantly. So we've got health, energy, transport. So obviously logistics and transport are very important. Drinking water, wastewater, sewage and systems. But new things like space is quite interesting. So satellite technology, satellite communications, obviously things like pillar banking is very important. Digital banking is critical now in most states and national and life. Public administration, obviously, the financial market infrastructure, highly digitalized, highly volatile. We've seen plenty of instances before where cyber attacks can disrupt financial markets. But another interesting couple here around digital infrastructure. So it's really critical now that large digital infrastructure, data centers, digital infrastructure providers, like the likes of potentially Microsoft and others, AWS, Google, etc., they're all critical components, essential components to a lot of our core infrastructure. And then another one that probably is going to bring the scope quite wide is around the ICT service management piece. So, the people who are actually supporting a lot of these organizations with their ICT management. So, managed service providers in ICT and cybersecurity will fall into this. That's quite a wide scope of organizations that I think might not have been under something like NIS2 before or NIS1. And then you've got the kind of important side, so your digital providers, things like research, food production disruption, postal courier services, waste management, manufacturing. And there's also a kind of a matrix, and there's a really good summary of this. Those of you who are Irish-based, if you go on to the NCSC website, they have a good kind of introduction to NIS2 document, and it kind of has a very useful table which shows a breakdown of the different sectors and what constitutes essential and important. And it's important to note that there is criteria such as the size of the organization and its actual size in terms of headcount and in terms of its revenue that will also push it from important to essential. So there are caps there. So things like, if you have more than 50 staff and more than 10 million turnover, that can push you, if you're an ICT service management provider, for example, into that important space or essential, depending on your size. Again, James, anything you want to add on the kind of this widening in scope?
Sure. I guess between our essential and important, the differences there, they don't just simply come down to the level of fines that might be applied or penalties, but it's in the application of the directive as well. When we think of our essential entities, they'll have ex ante and ex post supervision. We're not simply going to see with regulators and authorities that it's when an incident happens that we have that regulatory authority to deal with, or after we make a notification. There will be regular and targeted security audits, especially for essential entities and organizations that fall under scope. directly should certainly have processes in place for requests of information from regulators as well, and expect this, and not simply ad hoc audits after a significant event.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point around the audit side of things. Okay, so we mentioned in the previous slide there, people like digital infrastructure and digital providers. So one of the key questions we often get is around multinational, people who are, large companies that have a footprint in the EU but may not be headquartered here. Okay, so I think this is kind of important. So James, I think, do you want to kind of go into this in a bit more detail?
Sure. Well, I guess multinational organizations, Microsoft's a perfect example of one of those, with the wide breadth of solutions we have. But you mentioned looking at our supply chain, especially with multinational organizations working across jurisdictions. One consideration would be, well, within my supply chain, are there critical services being provided to me, and where are they being regulated? Where's their responsible authority? I might be an essential provider in Ireland, however, I may be using solutions sourced from across the globe, and what effect does that have on my supply chain? Also, if you're located outside of Europe, that doesn't mean you're off the hook. If you're critical to an EU member state's functioning, you will fall under scope as well. And any of these entities that are essential for European society need to make preparations, whether they're directly within the scope or not.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely key, and especially with the prevalence of many of the major digital providers, infrastructure providers are based outside the EU. So it was important that the EU made sure that they are also falling into scope. I mean, much the same way that like GDPR had a supranational kind of capability. It's the same with NIS2. And I think one thing that also bear in mind, if you are an organization who have offices and functions in lots of different EU states, you need to think about the fact that you could have multiple different oversight agencies looking at your organization and what it does. There is not really a concept of a single shop model like was in GDPR. So if you are an international multinational organization and you have services being provided in one European country and other services being provided from another European country, but you're providing both of those services to, key essential or important services in Europe, well, then you will have to think about, I'm supervisory bodies in both of those different national bodies will have oversight. So that is a bit of complication that multinationals need to think about. So I think that's probably a nice segue into, one of the biggest multinational providers and service providers who will be affected by NIS2, which is Microsoft. And I think, James, I'll hand over to you here as the Microsoft representative to kind of talk us through at a very high level some of the things how Microsoft is looking at around NIS2.
Sure, Paul. So to start, Microsoft, of course, seeks to provide a clear stance and position on any and all critical regulations that might affect us or our customers. Of course, as we mentioned already, Microsoft, with the wide breadth of solutions we provide and that global footprint, we fall under the scope of NIS2, and we're committed to complying with NIS2 as well, with the requirements. Our teams are closely monitoring legislative developments, partnering, of course, with policymakers as well to keep up to speed on the elaboration of the implementing acts as they come about towards the end of this year. And we have historically been dedicated to having strong security practices in place. And many of these are actually reflected in international standards and best practices now. Many of the cyber risk management measures that are identified in Article 21 of the NIS2 directive have already been taken by Microsoft, and we continue to have security and trust as central corporate values. Of course, given the type of services we provide, we're dedicated to aiding our customers in adopting resilient solutions and adhering to the principles of that, while we still maintain that shared responsibility approach. Our all-in-one suite of solutions includes security, compliance, and privacy solutions that, of course, can streamline your journey to NIS2 compliance as well. I believe you've control of the slides, Paul. So moving from NIS1 to NIS2, what does this mean for Microsoft, for our customers as well? The NIS2 directive, it's providing a legal measure to boost the overall level of cybersecurity in the EU. And the aim there is to continue contributing to the overall functioning of the internal market. And there are three main pillars that were the basis of the NIS directive. The first one was, of course, building on the NIS1 strategy of network security of network and information systems to have that high level of preparedness amongst member states. This requires that member states adopt a national cybersecurity strategy. They're also required to designate national cybersecurity incident response teams, CSIRTs, these being responsible for risk and incident handling, and then a competent national cybersecurity authority in a single point of contact. Secondly, the NIS directive also continues that NIS1 framework, establishing that NIS cooperation group to support and facilitate strategic cooperation and exchange of information, as Paul mentioned on a previous slide, among member states, the CSIRTs network, and so on. Lastly, NIS directive ensures that cybersecurity measures are taken across each sector in a uniform manner. These are vital, of course, for our economy and our society, which is so heavily reliant on ICT, across industries such as energy, transport, banking, financial markets, even drinking water, and digital infrastructure. So public and private entities that are identified by member states as operators of essential services in the relevant sectors, they're required to undertake cyber risk assessments, put in place appropriate and proportionate security measures, and they're also required to notify serious incidents to the relevant authorities. For digital service providers, key digital service providers, say search engines, cloud computing, online marketplaces, and such, these will also now fall under the same requirements. NIS2 directive, it significantly expands the scope of sectors, and it introduces size thresholds as well. So some of those myths you mentioned, Paul, about maybe I'm too small, it's the impact we would have that ultimately determines. There are limits set around revenue, size of the organization, and so on. But ultimately, what is our impact? What is that blast radius related to a security incident within our organization? We, of course, have those more stringent supervisory measures for national authorities, stricter enforcement requirements, and that harmonization of regimes across member states. NIS2, it's establishing a basic framework with the key actors on coordinated vulnerability disclosure for newly discovered vulnerabilities, and it creates that vulnerability database that Paul mentioned earlier as well. So
I think just I think as well as key, you mentioned it there, James, is NIS2 is establishing a kind of a floor, but this is all part of this evolving European policy landscape. This is part of a framework of regulation that's designed to kind of cover a whole bunch of these digital and cybersecurity and kind of privacy and all those different areas. So we've already seen this starting with things like with GDPR, obviously, and the various different Digital Services Act, the e-Privacy Act. Now we're seeing NIS2. We're seeing the kind of industry-specific, very, kind of, I would call them almost the daughter regulations of NIS2, which is things like DORA, which is the Digital Operations Resilience Act, specifically around the areas of financial regulation. And then, we're seeing things like the Cyber Resilience Act. Obviously, at the moment, we're also looking at the AI Act, should be finalised fairly soon as well. But this too is not a one and done kind of piece of work. This is part of a framework of the European policy landscape. That'd be fair to say, James, wouldn't it?
That's right. I think NIS2 will serve as the foundation for future significant laws, and shows it's a kind of bellwether regulation that shows the direction that we're going to go into in the future as well.
Yeah. We actually did just get a question coming in now. Just bear with me 1 second. So, question is, am I correct in saying that now in the event of a potential incident where personal data was impacted, it would now have to be reported to the Data Protection Commissioner? I'm guessing that would not have to be reported to the Data Commissioner and the NCSC. So I think the question is, like, if you have a data breach, that you would have to, obviously you'd have to report that to the DPC, but would you also now have to report that to the NCSC? It's a good question. I think my understanding, and James, please jump in with your thoughts. My understanding would be, if it's a significant data breach, then you would be reporting both to the DPC and the NCSC. I can't, imagine why you wouldn't be doing both if you fall under NIS2, obviously. So if you are under the NIS2 essential or important umbrella, and you had a data breach, I think you would report to both bodies, is my understanding. James, have you thoughts on that?
Yes, I would think so as well. Essentially, it means that we have more notification responsibilities placed upon us and more regulatory oversight. So say NCSC, of course, but also if we're in the financial services, then we would have the central banking authorities as well.
That's true, yeah, under DORA as well. It's going to be the CBI will be the regulator in that case. Yeah. Okay, good question. Okay, so we might just, do you want to skip over these, or do you think it's worth running through them? I think you covered a lot of these already, James.
Yeah, just to highlight, there is that 10 key areas that are highlighted within NIS2 that need to be addressed. And following on from the question we just had around incident reporting as well, that there's quite clear timelines set in the time that we need to provide those notifications to the authorities, and different levels too. So within 24 hours that we're giving an early warning, whereas then say within a month we have to follow up with a detailed description of either the issue itself and our steps towards remediation or progress in addressing that issue.
Yeah, I think that's a very key one, and it's one that we saw some of this kind of time sensitive requirements around reporting came in already with GDPR as per the previous question. So for data breaches of a significant or potential significant impact, you had to get that reported to your data protection authority, DPC, for example, in Ireland. This is obviously an even more stringent requirement, 24 hours for an early warning. So you may not have all the information, you may only suspect something has happened. The goal here is to get that in quickly, and I think that's something that organizations will probably need to ensure that they're capable of doing, bearing in mind that 24-hour clock could be starting from late on a Friday evening over a weekend, over a bank holiday, or something like that. So
Paul, that kind of comes to mind. I work for Microsoft, so I love statistics. I remember reading recently that once an attacker gains a foothold in a system, the global average is that it's just over 200 days typically before they're identified. So within NIS2, it's not simply that reporting up when we're aware, but it's having robust procedures and tooling in place so that we can identify when there's been a breach or a compromisation as well.
Yeah, and that's really going to come down to that strong cybersecurity hygiene, good baseline security controls, and very strong monitoring. So, and I think that's going to be a key element of this, is that ability to have, you know, real-time detection capabilities of unusual activity within your systems, within your network, so you can start investigating as quickly as possible, is going to be very important to be able to, you know, identify potential issues and get them reported within the requirements. And I think the mitigation and prevention information as well really is going to come down to planning. You know, it cannot be Groundhog Day every time you have a potential incident. To be good at this stuff requires having strong incident plans that are regularly tested and that are cross-functional teams within your organization. This is IT, this is security, but you also have to think about your business functions because you need to be able to understand potential impacts, and also, you know, messaging and controlling the messaging internally and externally. There's a lot of different areas that people need to think about in that incident handling crisis management team. So I think that's an area that maybe some of the smaller organizations that have come into scope now might need to evaluate to see, have they got a mature, robust ability in that space. Okay, so that's kind of what we wanted to talk about in terms of giving people a picture about what NIS2 is, what kind of requirements it's driving, who is likely to be in scope, and also I think the key thing is, even if you're not directly in scope, if you're in the supply chain of people who are in scope, they are going to be asking you hard questions on what your security controls are, because there is a responsibility on them to ensure that their supply chain is secure. So I think there's a lot of organizations who might not even fall directly under NIS2 who will still need to align to NIS2 requirements. We're now going to talk a little bit about how technologies like Microsoft, partners like CWSI can help you become compliant with NIS2. So there's a couple of things around the Microsoft piece. James, I suppose you're probably better placed to talk quickly about this.
Yes, we've touched on this already, the Microsoft having been at the forefront of developing cybersecurity solutions for our customers and ourselves as well, and that these cloud-based solutions, we have a secure and reliable platform for managing data and system security. Advanced threat detection, identity and access management. Our tools and guidance can help you meet the requirements of NIS2, and it's not solely tooling. We have teams of cybersecurity experts who can work with you to improve your current posture, but also if there is a need for additional support in responding to an incident. If we think of our detection and response team, our DART team, and being able to provide through the over 60 plus Microsoft security tools and solutions, a trusted partner, to give you that peace of mind that your systems are protected. So looking at some of these in more detail, having been at the forefront of developing advanced cybersecurity solutions, our cloud-based solutions providing that secure platform. We offer identity and access management solutions, as I mentioned, to help to ensure that only authorized personnel can access sensitive data and systems. Ensuring that we apply those minimum requirements of NIS2 initially, doing this through conducting risk assessments, implementing security procedures, and creating incident response plans. That team of cybersecurity specialists can help you develop a customized security plan tailored to your organization's specific needs. And then if we move to the next slide, Paul, to say monitor security threats in real time, we can use solutions like Microsoft Cloud App Security, Azure Sentinel, our SIEM for detection and response. Again, Azure Sentinel and Azure Security Center. When it comes to cybersecurity training, this isn't something we've touched on yet, but a big change within NIS2 is that at management level, there is a responsibility to ensure that our users are aware of best practices, what is secure digital working, and ensuring that that training that's employed in the organization is effective. So with Microsoft, we can help, of course, with our learning pathways, Microsoft Defender for Office 365. Office Defender for Office 365, for example, includes attack simulation training, and we can use that to educate our users. And then for our security teams, leveraging options like Microsoft Defender Threat Intelligence.
I think
of course, then
sorry, James, there was one thing there on the security awareness training that is, I think you raised a very key point that we hadn't touched on earlier on. That requirement around the leadership to get training, that's not just kind of your standard security awareness training, right? There's a focus now that leadership need to really get trained on management of cybersecurity risk. So, at a management level, what good cybersecurity risk management programs look like, and how what the ongoing monitoring of performance and success within that cybersecurity program and framework in organization looks like. So really putting an onus on the senior leadership to manage that risk, probably in the same way that they already do around the core things like financial risk. I think that'd be fair to say.
Exactly, yes. The security risks we face and the impact they can have on an organization now means that our approach to them has to be managed and approved at the senior levels of management and decision making. And of course, responsibility has to be taken for those decisions afterwards. I guess as well, speaking about supply chains, that leads into, thinking about minimizing the impact of an incident as well, how quick we can recover, and having Azure Site Recovery, Azure Backup in place to assist with this. It's not simply being aware of an incident happening, it's and how quickly we become aware of it and provide those meaningful notifications, but how much we can limit from day one the impact that might have.
Yep. Okay, just conscious of our time a little bit. There's a lot to cover. So there's a couple of key bits here. So this is a kind of a mapping that we've done ourselves in CWSI, working with Microsoft as one of their key CSI partners. So we're kind of a key security partner with Microsoft. So James has kind of talked a lot about what Microsoft themselves can do, but Microsoft also have a kind of a key ecosystem of security partners who kind of are experts in the Microsoft solutions and can augment and build on those Microsoft solutions to give an even more holistic set of services to customers. And I think as one of a small number of core partners for Microsoft in Ireland, CWSI are what's known as a CSI partner. We're also a member of MISA. We have a very close working relationship with product teams, with the service teams in Microsoft that allow us to kind of build on the capabilities and the technologies and augment those with our own services. So this is quite a busy slide, but it's what we've done here is we've kind of mapped the core NIS principles down the left-hand side. That you might have seen from one of the previous slides coming from the 10 key areas that have been published. In the middle is kind of a mapping that Microsoft had done themselves around, as a lot of the stuff that James was talking about and how the Microsoft technologies could help you with these different NIS principles. And then on the right-hand side really is where CWSI can kind of build on that. And also, just to say, our solutions, do go beyond just Microsoft. There is capabilities there to cover other providers, other technologies, because NIS2 is a very broad set of tools. While Microsoft is obviously a major infrastructure component in most organizations, and there will be other services as well, and we can address that through our own services and also through leveraging some Microsoft capabilities. So, for example, things like data security, the Purview suite, something that's very dear to my heart. That does have capability to extend into multi-cloud. We can do things like sensitivity labeling, data classification, DLP controls across multi-cloud locations. Similar with identity and access management. It's having a sort of a single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, enhanced conditional access, zero trust approach using Entra is fantastic for providing a identity and access control plane across lots of different services, SaaS services and internal services. And something that we do an awful lot of work around assessing the security around and making recommendations on how customers can improve on their identity and access security. And then some other kind of key areas are things around proactive security, so Defender Suite. So again, Defender XDR or whatever XDR you happen to be using are fantastic tools to have in place for that real-time detection and remediation of threats on your endpoints and potentially across your cloud solutions. But they need to be augmented by things like a SOC. So having a team of experts able to look at these different alerts that are coming in, use tooling and experience to correlate those different signals in to try and identify, is there really an issue here? Really focusing on that 24-hour requirement to identify an issue and get it reported. Not every organization is in a position that they have those kind of capabilities in-house, so that's something that CWSI can help you with. We have a managed SOC capability that can sit on top of Defender XDR and really help organizations get a handle on that instant response, instant handling requirement in NIS2. Data security I've already touched on. Supply chain, again, risk assessments, security and threat managed services around supply chain and all the platform management side of things. So there's a lot of different areas that CWSI as a kind of a full cybersecurity partner can help you with. You will notice, of course, there's always going to be a few blank ones. We're not saying that we can do absolutely everything. We will work with other partners or either existing partners that you have, or we can bring in partners that we've worked with ourselves that we trust to help in any areas that we ourselves have gaps in. But really what we want to be is a kind of a full journey partner with you around getting to NIS2, and most importantly, staying compliant, because all of these areas, it's not a one and done. There is a focus in NIS2 on continuous improvement, and it's important that organizations are always looking at developments in security tooling and in the threat landscape, vulnerability landscape, to ensure they stay up to date and stay protected. So I just want to wrap up now very quickly with some kind of key actions that we'd be recommending people to take now. So myself and James kind of came up with a couple of key questions that we think it's worth asking yourselves within organizations to kind of help you establish where you are and what your gaps and areas of focus might need to be. So like the first one is kind of, have you performed a gap analysis of your existing cybersecurity controls and governance against NIS2? So I think this is absolutely key. James mentions really good resources which map frameworks to NIS2. So if you're already under a framework, that could be a good way of looking at this. But just taking the 10 kind of key areas of NIS2 and looking at your existing controls, your processes, what understanding your critical business functions and processes and services. That's where you probably start around doing a gap analysis. And that's, if you haven't started that now, that's absolutely imperative that you do that as soon as possible against NIS2. The second one is around, have you already started your remediation readiness program and have you assessed your readiness to comply? So it's following on from the first one, really, assuming you've done that gap analysis, have you already started building out your remediation and readiness program? Like, it is already in force. There will be refinements coming by October with national legislation, so that will have to be factored in. But if you haven't started anything at all and you don't start anything until October, and you were to have a breach or incident within a couple of months of that October date, I think it wouldn't look particularly good to the regulator that you haven't done anything at all yet. You know, something is better than nothing here. You really need to get moving and having a look at these different things. James, is there anything you want to add on those?
As with compliance in general, until we can implement best practice, we need to be able to show best effort.
Yeah.
To put it simply, not to be seen with our sitting on our hands. That, and a lot of what is in NIS2, Paul, this is well known. You know, we mentioned things like MFA, identity permissions, but these are things that we've had to deal with for a long time. It's whether we've implemented them to a best practice level, and getting us to that.
Yeah, and I think from a compliance point of view as well, obviously it's highly important that you implement and have good controls and stuff in place, but it's also important that you have a compliance layer on top of those that ensures that all of those controls are documented and regularly tested and audited. Because if you do fall under the audit requirement in NIS2, you will be regularly audited by the supervisory body, either post or ante, as James already mentioned earlier on. I think a key one here is policies around BCP and incident handling. Again, we talked about these already, and James made an excellent point there a minute ago about the fact that this isn't new stuff. This is good cybersecurity hygiene that we've all been talking about in cybersecurity circles for, you know, over a decade. So it's really important. There's nothing here that is brand new in that way. It's just really putting some maturity around it and some compliance layers around it and ensuring that it actually happens. But business continuity and incident handling are obviously very important. So, you know, things like how you're going to recover in the case of a ransomware or you know, a denial of service or a major structural incident. You know, some of the stuff that James already mentioned, like the Azure site recovery, what your backup and recovery capabilities look like. And like incident handling, all of these things have to be regularly tested. It's very important that they're regularly tested to ensure that they work, that the rest of the business is aware of them and aware of their roles in them, and that they take into account new business lines or expansion in business lines or expansion or changes in the profile of the business that could make things more or less critical. Sorry, there seems to be an issue here with the slides keep disappearing. The questions. I think the last one we had here, or second last one, was around the board senior manager aware of the oversight and management of cyber risk. So this is, we mentioned this already around the training. There is a stick here as well, I think, which is that, you know, senior management board do have a personal liability element within NIS2. They can be directly have proceedings taken against them with, you know, obviously things like fines, but also there could be impacts such as being removed from or being struck off being able to serve on a board or as a senior manager for periods of time. So there is an element of personal responsibility as a stick there to kind of reinforce this requirement around getting senior management really driving the cyber risk requirements in organizations. Then, yeah, James, maybe you want to take this last one.
Yeah, and as we've talked about this quite a bit, evaluating our supply chain, who are the key suppliers within it, and how are they interacting with our systems, and what effect does that have on us under NIS2? Not only what's in our supply chain, but as well where we in the supply chain of maybe key customers and key partners, because that will have that downstream effect on us as well. Whether we're under scope or not. And of course, I guess, Paul, key question to ask as well is how do we approach compliance in general, particularly NIS2? Is this an obligation or do we see an opportunity? Improve our posture in general. Regulations aren't going to go away. We saw on that slide we talked about, you know, NIS2 being the stepping stone for more, not less. And is this an opportunity to maybe review what we have in place already, improve our posture, and then be more confident when in performing functions and providing services our businesses do.
I think that's an excellent point. I know, like, for example, there is an opportunity there for suppliers, in particular, ensuring that you meet things like NIS2 makes you more commercially attractive potentially, and it's going to make it much easier for you potentially to expand your business into other markets, because Europe is not alone here. There is very similar regulations coming in the UK, in the US. CISA are bringing in some similar kind of critical infrastructure regulations, very similar to NIS2. Similar stuff is happening in Australia and across Asia. So if you do the work to be good and get good at these kind of getting a good framework in place, and getting good controls in place, and getting good at meeting your obligations under something like NIS2, that will make it an awful lot easier for you to potentially meet similar regulations globally, which could allow you to expand your business commercially or offer a wider set of services. So there is always opportunity in these things. It's not just something that's seen as a drain on an organization. Okay, we've kind of run out of time. We got a few more questions, but I don't really think we've time to address them all. We would like to talk to all of you in more detail, though. So, there's a QR code on the screen. I can promise you it is a trustworthy QR code. I know as a cybersecurity practitioner, we're always a little wary of QR codes. But if you want to book a session with one of our consultants to talk about anything we spoke about today in more detail, you can use that, or you can reach out to the team. There will be a follow-up email to you all. We will be sharing the slides. That was one question that's coming in. And we can look at doing that to attendees, and you can reach out to our account managers or to our marketing team to try and talk to us about anything in particular. I'd really like to thank James for his time today. You can probably pick up, he's really deep in the detail of NIS2 and compliance and regulations across the cybersecurity and technology sector in general. So James, thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you as well to the audience. Really appreciate your time today, and I'm looking forward to speaking to some or all of you in the future. Hopefully it's an area that we can help you out with. So thanks very much.